Hey guys, in this lecture we're going to talk a bit more about mixins and more specifically about mixins with arguments. Now before we go into that, I want to quickly go through our new main SCSS file. Now if you finished the challenge that I gave you at the end of the previous lecture, then your main SCSS file should now look something like this. So you don't have all your mixins defined inside here anymore, but instead you have this import statement to import a new mixins partial. And accordingly, you should now also have this new _mixins.scss file where you have the actual mixin definitions. And that way we have all our mixins nicely separated from the rest of our code. And of course, we could just use this whole file in any other project as well. So once we have some useful mixins defined for us, we can just put them into a partial like this and then reuse that throughout all our projects. Alright, so I hope you did this challenge, and if not, you can just go ahead and create your partial right now with all the mixins inside it. And in this lecture we can now talk about mixins with arguments. And by defining our mixins with arguments, we can actually make them much more flexible so that we can use them in different circumstances. So let's say, for example, that for our rounded mixin, we want to actually be able to specify which border radius we actually want. So instead of having this fixed amount of 6 pixels, we want to be able to pass an argument into our mixin which defines how many pixels of border radius we want to have. And that's really easy to do, so let's just go ahead and do that right now. So we go to our rounded mixin, and after the name of our mixin we can just open up parentheses, and inside here we can now define our arguments. And syntax wise, our arguments look just like variables. So we're going to start by typing a $sign and then the name of our argument. So in this case I'm going to say radius. And now what we can do is we can use that right here. So we're going to say the border radius is supposed to be radius. And now we have this mixin with our argument defined. So now whenever we use this mixin, we have to pass this argument of radius into it so that it's clear how much border radius we actually want to have. So we're going to have to change all the places where we used this rounded mixin from before. And well, that's only down here in our box mixin. That's the only place we've used it so far. So let's now go ahead and pass in our arguments. So again, in our include statement, we're also going to open up parentheses behind the name. And then we're just going to put in the value we want to have. So in this case, let's say 8 pixels. So now we can go ahead and save this. And also we can save our SCSS file again to recompile this. We can see that everything went fine because our preprocessor doesn't give us any error messages. Alright, so let's go back to our mixins. And now I want to actually be able to also pass this same argument to our box mixin. So let's go ahead and also add a radius argument first. And then we also want to be able to change our border. So let's pass that in as well. And now what we can do is we can pass this argument further down into our rounded mixin. And for the border, we can now also just use our argument that we have. Alright, let's go ahead and save this. And now when we try to save our main SCSS file, that's not going to work because when we include our box mixin, we haven't used it correctly. So we're going to have to pass in a radius first. And then we're also going to have to pass in a border. So let's say 1 pixel solid. And then just some gray color. Hit save again, and now it's working as before. Alright, so let's assume you have a lot of mixins already defined, and that you've also used them heavily throughout your whole project. And now let's imagine you also want to add such arguments to make them more flexible. Now it's going to be a lot of work to change all these places where you include them, where you then have to pass in all your arguments, which you didn't have to do before. So you may wonder if there's any way to avoid this. And in fact there is, and it also has other advantages as well. So let's take a look at that. So let's hop back to our mixins file. And now what we can do is we can define default values. So for our radius argument, for example, we can go ahead and also add a value with the same syntax that we use for variables as well. So we can just put a colon there and then define our default value. So let's say 6 pixels, for example. And now whenever we include our mixin, we can choose to define a radius, but we can also leave the argument blank. And then it's just going to go ahead with 6 pixels, the default value. And we can do the same thing for our box. So let's say the radius should also have a default value of 6 pixels. And the border is supposed to be 1 pixel, solid and black. So now here for this mixin, we actually have 4 different ways to include this. We can choose to just pass none of the arguments, which is just going to go ahead with both of the default values. We can choose to just pass in the radius and go with the default border. We can also choose to just pass in the border, or we can of course pass in both arguments. So this makes the whole thing much more flexible. And also if we've used our mixin without any arguments throughout our code, we now wouldn't have to change all the include statements throughout our code, because it's just going to go ahead with the default values then. So let's test that out in our main SCSS file. So in our box we could for example only pass in the border radius and save this, and it's going to go fine. We could also just pass in none of the arguments, and it's also going to be fine. And we could also just pass in a border, but when we do that we have to be careful, because the border is our second argument. So if we were to just pass in a border here, then that would be our first perimeter, and that's not what we want. So how do we solve this? Well, we can specify the name of the argument we mean explicitly. So we're going to say border is supposed to be 1 pixel, solid and black, which is the default, so I'm going to say white in this case. Alright, hit save. And now let's look at the main CSS file that this gives us. So you can now see in our header, we have this border applied correctly, and for the border radius, the default value has been applied with these 6 pixels right here. Awesome, so let's go back to our SCSS file. And I want to show you one more thing you can do when you have multiple arguments like this. Now remember that our first argument is the border radius, and our second argument is the border. But when we use the explicit names, we can actually use the parameters in any order we want. So we can now leave our border as is, and then as our second argument, we could pass in the radius of, let's say, 12 pixels, for example. And because we used explicit names of our arguments, the preprocessor is now able to assign the correct values to the correct arguments. So let's go ahead and save this and just make sure in our main CSS file that this has all worked correctly. So you can now see that the border radius is 12 pixels and the border has also been applied correctly. Perfect. And there's actually one more advantage to this, because when you have many arguments, this also makes your code more readable, because you know exactly what the 12 pixels are supposed to mean. So in this case, it's the radius, for example. You could even call the argument border radius to make it even more explicit. So you know that these 12 pixels are not a font size or a padding or anything like that. It's a radius, and you can make that explicit by using the argument name. Now, of course, there's also the slight disadvantage that your code becomes a bit longer, but that's not too terrible and you shouldn't worry about that too much. It's much more important that your code is really readable for you and also for other people. Alright, so I want to show you one more thing that's important with arguments in Sass. So let's go back to our Mixins file. And let's actually go ahead and create a new Mixin. And let's call this box shadow. And this Mixin is supposed to apply, well, a box shadow. So I'm going to say box shadow, and we're going to pass that in as our shadow right here. We're going to say shadow, and we're also going to include the mass vendor prefix and the WebKit. Now, so far this is all just as we know it, but when using this mixin, you may actually want to pass in as many shadows as you want. So we're going to create something called a variable argument, or a vararg for short. And that's going to allow us to just specify one shadow after the other, as many as we want. And we can do that by going here, and we're going to call this shadows now, because it's going to be multiple of them. And then we're just going to put 3 dots behind it, and that's going to make it a vararg. And now when we include this mixin, we can just specify one shadow, then put a comma there, then specify another shadow, and we can actually do that as often as we want. So we're not limited to 1 or 2 or 3 shadows. So this is a great way to handle situations where you actually want to be able to put in multiple arguments of the same type, and the amount of them is not limited in any way. So it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, it doesn't really matter. And that's exactly when you use these varargs or variable arguments. So let's quickly go ahead and try out this new mixin. So for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to include this in the header. So I'm going to say include bug shadow, and then I'm going to pass in 2 shadows with pretty much arbitrary values. Let's say 1 pixel, 1 pixel, and this is going to look terrible, I'm pretty sure. Let's go ahead with the orange color. Okay, put a semicolon, save this. And now let's look at our web page. Alright, so this is actually quite okay. It's not as terrible as I thought. So you have this orange shadow here on the bottom, and you have this gray shadow on top. So the mixin worked, and we can just pass in as many shadows as we want in here. Alright, so now you know how you can define arguments. You also know how you can define default values for them. And you also know how you can include them by using the argument names explicitly, and also by skipping arguments with default values if you want to. And whenever you want to pass an arbitrary amount of arguments of the same type, you can use these var args by just putting 3 dots behind the variable name. Okay, great. So that's all about arguments in Sass. So you can try this out for yourself. Just go ahead and add some arguments to some of the mixins we have, and think about which mixins could be more flexible by using some arguments. Alright, so that's all for this lecture. See you in the next one.